Good afternoon and happy Wednesday to you. I hope you and your family are having a wonderful day. I hope you're well. Welcome back to our Bible study here as we look at the Psalms, prayers for the journey of life. I'm Pastor Stecker here at Grace Lutheran Church here in Nashua, New Hampshire. As always, I invite you to join in on our discussion as we go through our Bible study. You can do so here on the side in our comment section, virtual narthex as we call it. Also, you are invited to just comment on the video itself if you have any bigger questions, and I've got a feeling that there might be some bigger questions that we can unpack and discuss, because whenever I talk about the topics that we go over today, there's always a lot of really good follow-up questions that we won't be able to get into all those answers here in our main study, but we can certainly unpack those in our discussion later on. Also, if you have any, if you post some of these questions, later on, maybe we'll do another video that answers some of those questions. So I invite you to really engage, ask questions, think about these things critically, because these are very interesting things that we're going to look at here in Psalm 139. And Psalm 139 was requested to us by Lori, and Lori had a really good story that she shared about this of a friend or someone that she had met within the community here in Nashua, who was going through a sickness, and she was approaching death, and Lori, showed a lot of love to this individual and kind of walked with her through that process. And during that time, one of the psalms that they found really resonated was Psalm 139, which is really great because Psalm 139 really helps us see just the wonderful works of God and how He's always there in the good times and the bad times, and how ultimately what this brings is comfort for us, joy for us. As you can see, the title is Too Wonderful for Me. And that's what David says as he reflects here in Psalm 139 about God's presence with him and his power and his might. He says, this is too wonderful for me to even contemplate. Nonetheless, though, we do try to contemplate on it, and we pray and we sing and we study Psalm 139 and learn what David learns about just the magnificence of our God. And really, this whole psalm is going to, let me pull it up here. This whole psalm is really going to describe to us what Paul says in Acts chapter 17, verse 28, when he says, in Him, meaning in God or in Christ, in Jesus, in Him we live and move and have our being. In other words, our entire existence, our life, who we are, our day-by-day activities, all of this stuff that seems to us like a mystery, right? But it's not to God. God is in control of all things. And that's what we learned about here in Psalm 139. And really, we're going to unpack three words that maybe you've heard of, maybe you haven't. But they're three words that we use to describe God. And omni means essentially kind of all, and you see we have omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotence. And basically this means that when we say of God, we say that He is all-knowing, He knows all things. Omnipresence, He's all-present, He's always there. And three, omnipotence, meaning He's all-powerful. Now you might be able to see already some of the questions that often come from these terms. We'll get to some of them, but not all of them. And as you can see, we've got the verses broken up 1 through 6, 7 through 12, and 13 through 18. Now you might notice there are some more verses here in Psalm 139. I'm not going to dive into those, one for the sake of time because this is a longer psalm, and two because the last verses kind of pivot into something else that we're going to unpack in a later video, but I don't want to dive into it for the sake of time today. So we're just going to look at these three areas and at those 18 verses. So let's go ahead and jump in, and we'll start with verses 1 through 6. I'll go ahead and read them for you, and then we'll unpack omniscience. So David prays, I give you thanks, O Lord, with my whole heart. Before the gods I sing your praise. I bow down toward your holy temple. That's the wrong one. So Psalm 139, David prays, O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain it. So what does this mean? Well, here we see that David is unpacking the all-knowingness of God. You can hear it in things like in verse 4, even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you knew it altogether. You can't get any more omniscient than that. But also I want to introduce to you another term here, because David uses this here, and he uses this throughout the Psalms, and it's called mirrorism. And basically, and a good example of this is in verse 2 when he says, you know when I sit down and when I rise up. In other words, what David does is he uses two opposite actions. And whenever you see something like this, basically it's a poetic way of showing that pretty much everything is included. Whether I rise down, whether I stand up, God, you know all of it. The totality of it, you understand it all. Now the question that I want to pose before you, for this first section here, the omniscience of God, we see it in poetic language here in the first 6 verses. The question is, if God knows all things, which he does, and the Bible tells us this, is this unnerving to you, or does this bring you comfort? Now I'm guessing it probably brings a little bit of both, and that's the good thing, but ultimately we're going to have one win out over the other. I want to direct you to Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 13. The author of Hebrews says, and no creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give account. Now here, this might at first bring a little bit of uneasiness of knowing that God knows all things. In other words, there's nothing hidden from his eyes. And this might at first bring uneasiness, and at least what it should do is protect us from the falsity, that can be very harmful for us, of thinking that some things are done before other people, but some things we can do in hidden, in secret. That's not at all how we live our lives. We live our lives as Christians, as people who understand that God sees all things. There's no such thing as a hidden sin. God sees it all. It's laid bare before him. And what that does is, it might seem a little unnerving at first, but it's actually very protecting, because it stops us from thinking that we can do secret sins, which are actually very damaging to us. But sometimes we can convince ourselves that if nobody sees it, there's no harm done. The Bible does not take that approach. And that's something we can unpack even a little bit more. But for now, it suffices to say, why? Because God knows all things, and it's not hidden from him. And if it's not hidden from him, then it certainly isn't in secret. So the uneasiness is first, and that might actually be good. But ultimately, the way that David sums this all up is he says, this is too wonderful. It's too deep, it's too high, it's too wide for him to grasp. Now, of course, we know from David's story that he was certainly not sinless. We saw it with David and Bathsheba. We're going to see it even in other areas of his life. So if David himself had sins, and if David himself had struggles and shortcomings, and knows very well that God knows all of that, how does he still find comfort? Well, he finds comfort because in the end he understands that God is one who is always forgiving, merciful. He sees all things, and he's all-powerful, and this is good because God is a good God. He's a loving God, and he's a righteous God. And David knows that if he turns to God and trusts in him, that his all-knowing, all-powerful, always present self actually brings David comfort and love and grace, and this is a wonderful thing. So when we understand that God knows all things, it stops us from thinking that we can have hidden or secret sins, but at the same time, it brings us comfort to know if God knows all things, well, we'll get into him being in charge, but this is ultimately a good thing. Now, let's go ahead and move on to omnipresence, verses 7 through 12. David goes on, where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall overcome me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. Now here we see right at the beginning, David says, where shall I hide from you? Can I hide from your spirit? And it's the first good thing just to note that David's not actually ever trying to really escape God's presence. But he's asking this as a rhetorical question. He's saying, is there anything that I can do? Is there any place that I can go to the bottom of the sea, to the height, to the width? Is there any place I can go where God is not there? And the answer that he comes to, and this is of course a psalm of praise, and he's giving thanks for this, is no. David is always there. One of the commentators really puts this well, and he says this. He says, perhaps if David were to make light itself his chariot and ride at 186,000 miles per second, maybe then he could escape God's presence. Alas, not even the lightning-like rapidity with which the rays of the sun dart from east to west as they break out over the horizon at dawn, the wings of the morning, in verse 9, are sufficiently speedy to outrun God. That's beautiful, isn't it? The fact that there is nothing that can outrun God. There's nothing that can hide from God's presence. And if God is good and God is just, then we want God to be present in all things. And that shows us that the bad things that take place, God opposes that, but he's never fully disconnected from it. His presence will ultimately turn those bad things into good. It will turn evil into joy. It will turn mourning into rejoicing. Every tear shall be wiped away from our eyes and from everyone's eyes. Jeremiah 23 puts it this way, can a man hide himself in secret places so that I cannot see him, declares the Lord? Do I not fill heaven and earth, declares the Lord? I'll go ahead and address one thing to make sure that we don't stumble into a misconception here, and that is that God is present in all things, but we also understand God as being distinct from all things. There's a thought that often creeps into our minds when we study this subject. And it's not that we mean to go here, but it ends up becoming something called pantheism. And pantheism, Hinduism would be probably the closest to this, is the idea that that all things around us, God is present in all of those things. In other words, there's not a distinction between the trees or the rocks and God. They're all one and the same. This is kind of the way the Hinduism religion goes, and often people think about it that way, and they say, well, why would I need to come to church or, take the body and blood of Christ? If God's just as present in a tree or in a river, because he's omnipresent, then can I just worship any one of those things and it will be God? The answer is no. God is always present, but he is distinct from his creation, right? He creates all things, and he's present in all things, but he is always distinct. God is not a tree. Or more importantly, a tree is not God. The rocks are not God. The river is not God. So we do want to make that distinction. That's not what we mean when we say all present. If you're at the river and you're sitting there, is God present? Sure. Is the river God? Absolutely not. That's when we start to move into very different understandings of God. So just want to make that clarification here. And moving on, I want to bring before us two more quotes that show us both the comfort of God being present in all things, but also how it brings a little bit of change in our life, or motivation for change in our life, and how if this is applied to our day-to-day activities, it can really help us through life. First, the quote about comfort, and this is again from Sam Storms, one of the commentators. He says, no matter what the trial, no matter the place of its occurrence, no matter the swiftness with which it assaults, no matter the depth of its power, God is ever with us. His loving protection ever abides. Yea, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And of course, the end of that is from Psalm 23, which we will probably look at next week, as some of you have requested that yesterday in our video. Also, I think when we look at Psalm 23, we will do so with the King James Version, because I just like thy rod and thy staff. It's just how we were brought up. But anyway, this shows that it's so comforting to know that God is with us, and his rod and his staff, it protects us no matter what we're going through, and we will go through a lot because we're in the valley of the shadow of death. But God's presence is comforting, it's great. David finds it comforting and great. He says, it's too wonderful for me to even imagine. Same with us, no matter what we're going through, to understand that God is there, he understands what we're going through, and ultimately he's in control. It brings more comfort than anything else that I can think of. Last, a quote here about how this ultimately changed our lives. I thought this was quite intuitive. One of the commentators says, understanding this would make us spiritual, raised and watchful in all our passions, if we considered that God is present with us in our shops, in our chambers, in our walks, and in our meetings. In other words, understanding that God is with us, he's there, and he's calling us to our daily vocations, at our job, with our family. What would that do? How would that shape the way that we interact with others, interact with the job we do? And I think what it should do is give it meaning, knowing that God is there, he knows what you're doing, and he's supporting you. And also just a good motivation to say, I want to please God, and I want to please my neighbor in this which I've been called to do. God is all-knowing, he's all-present, and last, he's omnipotent, he's all-powerful. We'll go ahead and close with this, verses 13 through 18. As I said, the psalm does go on, and we'll cover that topic in a later video. But this is beautiful, verses 13 and 14 especially. Verse 13, for you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there were none of them. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God, how vast is the sum of them. If I would count them, they are more than the sand. I awake, and I am still with you. Now, David points to two different things in these 5 verses, showcasing God's ultimate power over and in life. And first, he points to how he was fashioned in his own mother's womb. In other words, in verses 13 and 14 especially, he's pointing to the miracle of life. And what he's saying is, my physical body, my psychology, even the way that my mind works, my personality, my skills, my passions, the kind of vocations that I'm good at, these are things that God intricately wove together even when he was in his mother's womb. How powerful is that? I remember C.S. Lewis, if I couldn't find it, I think it was maybe in the Grand Miracle, talks about how, in all reality, God is the creator of all life. Husbands or fathers are just the means by which God brings life into this world. But ultimately, God is the creator of every single life. And he does. He knits us all together in his mother's womb. You can't get any more powerful than that. In fact, I don't even think I can really unpack it with any illustrations. If you've ever seen children, if you've ever known yourself, if you've never known others, just the vastness, the variety, and the wonderful gifts that people have and the way they come together in certain situations in life, you just have to say, how great are you, God? Second, David then turns, and not only to the formation of himself, but in the second half of this, he turns to the formation of all of David's days. He says, you know and you formed each and every day. In other words, each day that David encounters, he looks up and says, God, you formed today. You authored today. You've presented things before me. You've made the sun rise today. What if we started each day like that? And we said, God, I know you're present. I know you know all things. And I know you're powerful enough to have authored today. Beautiful, yes? Now, I want to go ahead and close with this. And it's to at least deal with one of the questions that would arise throughout this. And it will also help us unpack omnipotence a little bit more. So often there's the question about, well, if God's in charge of everything, do I actually make any decisions myself? Or does God force me to make those decisions? In other words, God's all-powerful, but do I have a free will? And the answer, which is obviously much more complicated than I'm going to unpack here, is that we do have a free will. God gives us free will, but at the same time, he's in control. Now, how does that work? Am I just punting on this answer by saying yes to both? Well, let me at least give you an example. So I'm here at Grace Lutheran Church, and it was a long road that brought me here. And I've used this example before, I think in a sermon. But there are so many different things that have happened in my life that caused me to come here. For instance, when I was working before I went to seminary, I had to make the decision on whether or not I was going to go to sem and whether or not I was going to postpone that a year. And it just so happened that with my job and where I was working, I said, this is a good time for me to go. And so I went to sem. And throughout that whole experience, I had various experiences and situations throughout my sem which formed me and my own personality, my own approach on ministry. And then on top of that, during the summer after my second year of seminary, two very important things happened. One, I took a trip out to New England, out to the Northeast with a good friend of mine, Matt. And we were out here exploring. We took about 10 days and we just wanted to see some national parks, see New England. And we did, and I fell in love with the place. And I thought, this is beautiful. But another thing happened, and that is during that summer I met my wife. And the way I met my wife, just ran into her essentially in a different city when I was visiting up in Toronto. And I made the decision afterwards to continue to talk with her. We talked long distance, and we put a lot of work into that, and we planned to go visit each other at least once or twice a month. So a lot of those things were under my control. I made the decision, I did, to continue to pursue my wife and her to continue to pursue me. I made the trip with my buddy to take time and go visit New England over that summer. Did God force me to do those things? The answer is no, he didn't force me to do those things. Did he know that those things were going to happen? Yeah, I certainly think so, but he didn't force me. I had free will, and God knew that those things were going to happen. Now here's the thing, here's how all this comes to the culmination. The way that I got sent out here to be a pastor was I had to go through a call process. I'm not going to get into that, but it's complicated. But I will say that I put New England in this area of the country, I ranked it very high in my rankings. That's not the only thing they take into account, but it's one of them. And the only reason I ranked that high was because my wife and I were both open to going and traveling and living somewhere else other than where we were raised. And I would say that if I were not married to my wife, and if I were single, I would have been much less apt to move across the country 13 hours away from family and friends. But I was much more comfortable to do so because I was married. And the reason I ranked New England so high was because I had come out here on a trip earlier and fell in love with the area and the landscape. Now, do you see what I'm getting at? Did God want me to come here and be a pastor? Absolutely, certainly. God was in control. He was the one that authored that. I was not in control of that. However, was I in control of deciding to pursue my wife and deciding to take a trip out here? Absolutely. All I can say is that God gives us free will to make choices, and he does allow that, okay? God didn't take those choices away from me. But God is ultimately also in control. Now, I can't explain to you the details of God's all-powerful and the way he controlled that, and when my free will came into being. All I can say is that both were present, and in the end, God's will was done. Questions? Post them below. It's a big topic. I hope this illustration helped. In the end, what we do is we find security, and we find peace, and we find motivation, because we have a God who knows all things, is present in all things, and is in charge of all things. And this motivates us to live a Christian life for that God. And knowing that he is there with us throughout that whole thing, but ultimately knowing that he is in control. And all things are not up to us. And that should take a lot of relief off of our shoulders to know we have a God, and it's just way too wonderful for me how great of a God he is. Omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotence. Let's now go ahead and close with Luther's prayer on this psalm. Pray with me. How excellent, O Lord, have your thoughts been toward us, and that you made us after your image. And when we were lost in sin, you sent your Son to redeem us and granted your Spirit to renew us unto righteousness and true holiness. Thanks be to your mercy, now and forever. Amen. Thank you for joining us for this Bible study. I hope you enjoyed Psalm 139. Lori, again, thank you for suggesting this psalm, and thank you to all of you who have suggested the psalms. Have a wonderful day. God be with you.